Hey everybody, TacticAngel here, back on the PlayStation 5 to run down the history of the USS Saipan, which appears in World of Warships Legends as a Tier 7 premium aircraft carrier. My review of the Saipan should follow shortly, and once that is available, you should see a link to it down in the description. The USS Saipan was the lead ship of her class of light aircraft carriers, designed and at least partially built towards the end of World War II. The advent of the light carrier and escort carrier for the United States Navy actually comes just before U.S. involvement in World War II. Though you wouldn't know it by the end of the war, prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy was actually not extremely keen on the concept of small carriers, initially committing only to the construction of 2 escort carriers, at this point known as auxiliary aircraft escort vessels, for testing purposes. These would be the 2 carriers of the Long Island class, the USS Long Island and HMS Archer. These were built on C-3 class commercial cargo ship hulls. Initial recommendations of the United States Naval Board was that small carriers had too many disadvantages. Generally speaking, the cost of operating naval aircraft on a per-plane basis is higher on a smaller ship because you still need all the other crew to run normal ship stuff. You need the logistics to support them, and they may not be able to operate where larger carriers could in certain sea states, and smaller carriers have higher accident rates. That is a polite way of saying that trying to land a plane on a really big ship is hard enough. If you make that deck 2/3 as wide and half as long, you stand a decent chance of losing more pilots on a temporary or potentially permanent basis, just as a course of day-to-day operation. So, in October 1941, the Naval Board essentially said that the test was a failure. Their boss, on the other hand, said to do it over, but this time come to a different conclusion. Their boss, of course, was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. As it turns out, being President of the United States can mean that you're a fairly influential character, and given the attack on Pearl Harbor that would occur just 2 months later, the U.S. Navy suddenly found itself with a very large operational theater that could benefit from some air support. Though this also helped speed along the construction of Essex-class carriers, the Navy ended up ordering a few escort carriers and reordering 9 Cleveland-class light cruisers as light aircraft carriers. These 9 ships would become the carriers of the Independence class. A very brief explanation on the difference between an escort carrier and a light carrier. Essentially, the escort carrier was not originally envisioned as a combat unit. They were more intended to be convoy escorts and aircraft transports. They were renamed from auxiliary aircraft carrier to escort carrier in part to acknowledge their increased combat roles, which involved supporting a lot more land units than originally intended. Though not a requirement of the class, these ships were all built on existing hulls of commercial vessels, or in the case of the Casablanca class, built from the ground up on a commercial design and using commercial as opposed to military construction techniques. They essentially were unarmored and had design speeds less than 20 knots. American light carriers were built on cruiser hulls rather than cargo or oiler hulls. They had a little bit of armor and could scoot around at over 30 knots. Which meant that they were capable of keeping up with and operating alongside full-sized fleet carriers. Where the Saipan class finally comes in is with these smaller, less well-protected light carriers operating with carrier strike groups. It was expected that some of them may be lost. Only one, the USS Princeton, was, though the US Navy did lose a handful of its escort carriers. The Saipan class was ordered to replace those expected losses and was an incremental improvement over the Independence class. Built on an extended Baltimore hull, the Saipans had a larger flight deck and hangar space than the Independence class ships. In total, Saipan was about 60 feet longer and 5 feet wider at the beam. Sometimes it is mentioned as significant that the Saipan is built off of a heavy cruiser hull rather than a light cruiser hull like the Cleveland. While it is true that the Saipans had slightly better armor, the difference here is a modest 2 inches versus 4, neither of which would do you a lot of good if you got in a serious gunfight, though the fact that they were armored at all and had considerably more watertight compartments meant that they were, both, significantly more durable than escort carriers. Though built on a modified cruiser hull, unlike the Independence class, the Saipans were designed from the ground up as a carrier, so these were not actually conversions. As a result of the built-in efficiency and increased size, the Saipan's flight group would have been around 50 aircraft, rather than the Independence class, which housed only 27 to 30 aircraft in practice, which itself is a similar size flight group as you'd find on most escort carriers. Though the Independence saw service during World War II, the Saipan was laid down in July 1944, launched a year later in July 1945, and the government of Japan would sign the Instrument of Surrender just 2 months later. Even without the prospect of service in World War II, she was completed and commissioned into service in July 1946. Saipan's operational history as an aircraft carrier is fairly limited. The only major conflict that occurred during her service history was the Korean War. She didn't have a direct operational involvement there until basically after the war, if you consider it having ever ended, flying recon and overseeing the uneasy armistice that continues to this day. She also participated in early testing for jet aircraft operating off of an aircraft carrier. Unfortunately, this last part would end up spelling the end of her career, at least as an aircraft carrier, as planes became too large and heavy to operate off of such a small vessel. She was taken out of service in 1957. Due to having a lot of empty space inside her hull, the Saipan and her sister ship, the USS Wright, were converted to other purposes. The Saipan became a communication relay ship and was renamed the USS Arlington. Strangely, the USS Wright, named for pioneer aviator Orville Wright, was not renamed when she ceased to be an aircraft carrier and continued as a command cruiser USS Wright. In any case, the Arlington participated in the Vietnam War, though as a communication ship there's little to talk about there. She also was part of the recovery group for Apollo missions 8, 10, and 11. The Arlington was decommissioned in 1970 and then sold for scrap in 1976. And that pretty much finishes off the history of the Saipan. Once again, please check out my review of the ship once it is available below. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I'll see you on the next one.